Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure to be speaking to you. There's two reasons in particular that I'm very excited to have the chance to speak to you. One is that you created the yoga mat to which I have devoted my practice by standing on it every morning for the past decade or so, Manduka. And secondly, because you were kind enough to send me a copy of your book, Gravity and Grace, which I'd like to talk to you a little bit about from the perspective of, particularly the last part of the title, grace, and this question of what has to open up in us, I think, to get anywhere really with yoga practice, because there's a lot of emphasis in the modern yoga world on doing things. Everybody thinks of yoga as a thing to do, but yoga is kind of what happens when we let go of the attempt to do everything. And you start with a really nice quote on that from a French author, Simone Weil, talking about how grace is what fills the empty spaces in us, but we've got to clear things out of the way for those spaces to exist, and it's grace that enables us to do that. So it's one long process of letting go, and your book's a whole sequence of events involving letting go. And I'd really like to start by talking about the one that you opened the book with, your relationship with a teacher who had an enormous influence on your life, Shandor Remete, and at the same time, who, a bit like other famous teachers have done throughout yoga history, told their students, off you go now, you've got all you're getting, goodbye. And I wonder if we could
wish
rewind.
it was that. I wish it had been that civil.
Well, I'd like to ask you about that dimension as well. But I wonder if we could just rewind to how you ever got involved with Shandor in the first place. You were living at that time in New Zealand, is that right?
Correct. Yeah. My relationship with yoga in those days before in New Zealand was pretty casual. And I accidentally discovered yoga like many people do, just random interaction. And there was something in me that drew me towards it, like I could feel this pull. And my first experience of it was profound. I had this unique experience of this slight separation from my physical body and some other type of body, what I refer to, I think, as my energy body. Like there were things that were moving and I didn't understand what they were. And that rose the curiosity for me to practice. But it was never done with any philosophy in mind. It was just a physical practice, being an athlete. So throughout college, I would tokenly go to a yoga class, or I would do little yoga poses before working out in the gym. And it was great cross training, but I had no space in my life for anything more than that. I had this experience after university of working for someone who was captain of a local rugby team. And I didn't even know what rugby was.
Not big in America, is it? Yeah.
No. Ironically, the Americans, I learned this years ago, the first Olympic rugby gold medal was won by America.
I had no
And
idea.
this is so back, and most of the team was these expatriate Scottish, Irish, English, so it was not really America, but it was. Anyway, so I get this job. One of the conditions of the job is you got to play on our rugby team, because I was an athlete and a lot bigger, stronger, etc., faster. And so I enjoyed this rugby team and I enjoyed the sport. And there was something really athletically satisfying and challenging about it that I was just naturally drawn to. And unbelievably, this team, our sevens side, won a national championship. And so we had a member of our team was a New Zealander, and he said, "Hey guys, I can organize this tour in New Zealand. Do you want to go?" And there was 10 of us, and we all said, "Yeah, let's go." So, and I had just come out of a relationship, so I was ready for an adventure. And so we go to New Zealand and we play these matches, and then I realized I want to stay in New Zealand. And so I stay in New Zealand, and I play on a team that's a club team. And in American playing rugby in those days was, I don't know, we were so bad that I think the only reason they let me play was for entertainment, and to have a good
to
laugh.
knock you down, probably as well.
think. And so I realized that I was going to get hurt and that I was too old. Basically, I was late 20s and everything I was playing on was in the early 20s. And so literally within a couple of weeks, I was living in Wellington, and I came across a board that had a flyer about a yoga class. I think, great, I want to do some yoga. And the teacher of that yoga class was a student of Shandor's, and she was hosting him in 2 weeks. And she said, I think you'd really like this teacher. You guys are kind of similar, you know. And I think she was saying, you're a man and you're kind of athletic and you're kind of, your ego is a little bigger than it needs to be. And I think you'll kind of like him, you know. And so I showed up, and it was the first male teacher I'd ever experienced. And so that was unique. He was a strong, athletic man who, not only that, was ex special services in the Australian Army in Vietnam. So there was this level of macho-ness that in those days I was kind of attracted to. You know, it was like, wow, this is a man's man, and I want to hang out with a man's man, because I grew up during the women's liberation movement era in the 60s. And so testosterone was like a toxic chemical in those days. And I just wanted to move as far away from that as possible. And there's a whole lot of psychology behind that. But I felt like Shandor's going to fill a void in me. And that was exactly what happened. There was something about how he delivered the message of yoga that went right into the deepest core of me. And I was having these profound post-class experiences after attending his classes and workshops. And so my understanding of yoga was you commit, you don't jump around to different teachers, you just commit to one master teacher. And that's what I did. And for 20 years, I studied with him. Every time he'd come to New Zealand, which was once a year, I would go to Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and take time off from work and study with him. And the relationship continued when I moved back to the States, and he had not taught much in the States, and he asked me to kind of manage his tours here. And that's where we got really close, traveling together for a couple months a year.
I'm intrigued by the way in which he taught, though, which you describe in your book in slightly less flattering terms. You talk about, if I remember rightly, a vehement tone and a subliminal threat of humiliation. And I wonder how that squares with the deeper states of yoga you just alluded to.
Well, he was just parodying his teacher being BKS Iyengar, which I at that point didn't know who he was, but once I met Iyengar, then it was like, oh, this is where Shandor gets that from. And plus he's Hungarian, you know, like it's like in most kind of Eastern European countries, there's that tradition of macho, you know, and my heritage is the same, Greek, you know, there's that quality of macho that, I don't know, you know, it's out of balance, I think, for most men, but there's a necessary component of being macho. That's why men are men. And I feel like yoga practice, I said this recently at a convention, that yoga is about the integration of the masculine principle and the feminine principle. And when that integration happens, literally the state of beings that we create are non-binary. And in this current age, this word non-binary is really charged. It has a charge to it on both sides of the conversation. But when you look at it from a yogic perspective, this journey that we're on in life is to recognize that all of us, doesn't matter the gender, all of us have this masculine and feminine principle. And the goal of yoga is to bring it into balance, into the central channel of our lives. And once it's in balance, there isn't a strong attachment to whether I'm a man or a woman. It's just this shared experience of wholeness that we all possess the potential for. And once we have that, the conversation loses its charge. We relate to each other as brother and sister. And for me, that's the way I'm living my life now, that I make space for conversations, and I'm not too attached to the outcome of those conversations, because ultimately our goal is to recognize our oneness, and period.
Sounds like though when you were younger, you had, I mean, first of all, that description of your sort of attraction to a strong male authority figure, but you had a sense perhaps that you needed to get somewhere through yoga practice, that there
That's
was
right.
something you had to build up rather than let go of.
Exactly.
And it was as if Shandor had all the secrets, and that one day he might
Exactly.
reveal them to you. I wonder
Yeah,
if you could
and
talk a little
I
bit about
found
what you
out
were
later.
looking for. Go on. Sorry.
I found out later that kind of attractive quality of someone like myself seeking out that strong masculine presence was in some ways his way of marketing. Like, he had a very unique role even in those days, in an industry where most of the not ordinary, most of the typical yoga teachers in those, that time period, were female.
Yeah.
And, for me, that was my experience for the first 2 years of my understanding of yoga. The female teachers were teaching me stuff I didn't even know what they were talking about. And they were moving their bodies in ways that I thought, oh, I'll never be able to move. That's how women move. I can't move like that. I don't have that degree of
Mm.
flexibility, until I met Shandor. And he had something that I wanted. He had flexibility and strength. And he had a very strong masculine principle that I had been programmed out of. I was a peacemaker. I was a helper. I had that kind of orientation because I was raised basically by a single mother. And it's not that my parents weren't in relationship, but my dad was working 10, 12-hour days and exhausted at the end of the day. So this was, for me, this kind of reaction to what was predominantly learning how to be a man from a woman's perspective. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, it was out of balance. And I was seeking balance. And Shandor Shandor took me to the other extreme. It's like this polarization. And it wasn't until our severing of relationship that I had the opportunity to resolve that polarization. And that process took me probably 5 or 6 years to understand what I was dealing with.
We talk a little bit about that separation process. It sounded very sharp, very sudden, and very blunt. You quote some of the things he said to you in your book. First of all, telling you it's time to get off the tit because you shouldn't be either a soldier or an apprentice. They were the two worst things in life to be. So
That's
expecting
right.
everything from him after this much time was too much. And then he also told you that you shouldn't teach anything that he taught you, which
Yeah.
I really didn't quite know how to process. And I wonder how you made sense of that particularly. You spent all this time accumulating all this knowledge, and he tells you, well, that's mine. You go and find your own. You can't talk about
Yeah.
that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly the lead up to that confrontation at the end, was that I had been, studying with him for 20 years and assisting his North American programs and making, personal sacrifices to support his life here in the States. And I was getting compensated for it, and not even financially, but also energetically. I was learning so much. I had a seat on stage, literally, of watching him teach and assisting his teaching and traveling and practicing with him before our classes. We would practice, we'd get up at 3 a.m, practice from 4 to 6, and then he'd start teaching at 6. So that I wouldn't trade for anything. But there were esoteric practices that he was doing in those morning practices before class that he wouldn't teach me. He'd just say, sit and watch. And I started to get a little, well, how come he's not? I started to question, what's his philosophy here? Why is he excluding me from practicing those things? And so I was getting impatient, and everything was starting to come to a head for me. Like, I want the good stuff. I want that special stuff. These these
Was that things like Keichiri Mudra? He cut his
exactly.
tongue, popping it up in the back. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't going to cut my tongue, but I saw what he was doing before he cut his tongue, and I wanted to learn those, and he wouldn't teach me. Yeah, and so those kinds of practices, I felt I had earned the right to receive them. And so I left these are pre-emailed kind of days. I left a message on his answering machine saying, and it was a long message. And I said, hey, I want to learn this stuff. And his short reply on my answering machine when I got the message was, yes, it's time we talk. And I was super excited by that because I know he can be very cryptic at times with communication, really short and to the point. And so I had this optimism and this hope that, okay, he sees me, like I'm going to get the good stuff. And as the story goes that I talk about in the book, the month that he was here in the US traveling together, he didn't mention the talk once. And I wasn't going to press him because I figured he's going to tell me in his own time. And on the last day, literally, he's flying to Australia in 2 hours. He says, come on, let's take a walk. And we've got something to talk about. And I finally, but what's he going to say in this short period of time? The taxi's coming in like 50 minutes. And we get to a park in my neighborhood, sit on a bench, and he says, Peter, you know this story. There's two things in life. You don't want to be a soldier and apprentice. And in that moment, this like mental curtain just came crashing down on me, and everything mentally went blank. And it was like, what is he saying to me? And there was adrenaline coursing through my body. I could feel it. And it was like, oh, something big's about to happen here. And then he went on, and then the famous line, it's time to get off the tit. And in that moment, a wave of despair, almost realizing that the life I had known up until that for the last 20 years was gone. And so we walked in silence back to my house, and there was a coldness in his energy towards me, and I was in shock. And he gets his bags. The taxi is at the curb already. I'm just standing out in the front porch. He's in the house getting his bags. He comes out, walks right past me without even looking at me, gets to the cab, throws his bag in the back. The driver goes around one way, he goes to the other. He opens the door, and that's it. And then he stops, turns around, and the street is pretty close. And he just says, oh, by the way, don't teach anything I ever taught you. And he gets in the cab and he drives off. And I'm standing, on the porch, just going, what just happened? Like, what am I going to teach? What am I going to do? And the rest of that story evolved, like it just, the shock, the reaction to shock, the trying to escape, stop practicing yoga. I just was in a tailspin. But eventually, time kind of creates environments where you start to pick it apart. And I started to see that it was a gift. What he gave me was a gift. And I've not seen him do that to too many other teachers, senior teachers of his, where he asks them to leave. This was a break that was not of my choice, but in the end, and when I ran into him many years later, I got a confirmation that he gave that to me. He didn't, it wasn't something that he was doing to me. It was something that he was doing for me. And just my psychology needed an initiation into manhood that's by myself. And what does it really mean to be a man? And it's not following. Men don't make great followers. They're, in a way been programmed to be leaders. And for me, it's not that women can't be leaders, but that DNA is so strong in men. And I lacked it. I didn't feel like I had it.
Certainly,
So
stepping into one's own autonomy seems very important in that sense.
exactly.
And at the same time, though, I do feel moved to question whether he could do that slightly differently. You mention at the end of the book that the sort of measure of how helpful your yoga practice is in your life is whether it makes you kinder. And I wonder if he could have done that more kindly and still achieved the desired effect.
That's a big question. And with his journey, his life's journey, he has kindness. I've seen him do amazingly kind things. How much of his teaching was theatric? You know, this is the role as teachers that yoga teachers find themselves in. And when you go to an average yoga class, there's a lot of theater in these classes. And I think in those days, there was theater in his teaching, and maybe this was theater for him. I can't answer that. I've never sat down and said, did you really intend to do that, or were you in reaction to something? And again, I could dwell on the negative here instead of, oh, he didn't do it kindly. But what he did was so strong and powerful, it shook the very foundation of what my ego attached to. And
Mm.
so that break in ego attachment, if you look at all the spiritual traditions in the world, that's a necessary step. And he gave that to me. He just cut my knees out from under me. And how many people, I just recently read this. Emotions become traumatic when we attach to them, but emotions are meant to pass through, just like any thought, just like any sensation. And just the wisdom of the Buddha is everything is temporary. Okay, so everything is just on its way somewhere. And when we get attached to an emotion, a trauma, emotion that's strong, the trauma is that holding and the suffering that comes from that holding. How do we heal from that? Uh, how do we move through trauma with a healing experience? And the answer for me was, you have to let it go. And what he gave me forced me into letting go of who I thought I was in that moment. And then the question is, well, who am I? How many human beings over, the millennia have asked themselves that question? And I had to answer it for myself. And it took me years to come to even approach that question. And then I feel through, like what you said earlier, through the practice of yoga, I started to understand, oh, this is who I am. And now I have a much clearer understanding of who I am. And it's not this physical body, it's not this mind that's creating thoughts. It's more of this role as an observer. Like, I've come to realize that the true self that is I identify with is observing this process of life. And I can choose to attach to one of what I'm observing emotionally or intellectually, but then I can also let it go emotionally or intellectually, because there's a state of being that's beyond thought. And those experiences, I've had many throughout my yoga journey. And those are states of being that create healing for this being that I embody. But also, as I teach, the students start to realize that they're not in an average yoga class. I'm not going to teach them how to do trikonasana. I'm not going to teach them how to physically do much, but I'm going to guide their attention into the subtlest of experiences within their physical body. And then the physical body responds to that. And this is my role as a teacher. My primary role, I should call myself an intuition teacher, because what I'm trying to do is what Shandor gave me, is rely on your own intuition. And how do you cultivate that? This is where grace comes in. We need voids. We need voids where we empty the cup, so to speak, and in all humility, open to the possibility of divinity, of divine presence in our lives. And that step is a personal step for every human being I know. You choose to take it or not.
Well, indeed, yeah. I mean, the more extreme the circumstances, the sharper the challenge in a way. You know, it will make you or it will break you. And you've had several in your life that
Yeah.
you detail in the book. And I'd like to go on and talk about another one in a moment about, you know, extreme pain and having to integrate the process of recovery using yoga. But before we get there, I do want to just dwell a moment longer on this question of how to actually engage in that process. Because the way you've just described what you're teaching is, you know, oriented in a similar direction, pointing people towards, you know, some other way of experiencing reality than being over-identified with the surface and the idea and the physical flesh. And at the same time, you know, you're pushing them into a place that's perhaps not immediately comfortable. You're asking them to see beyond, you know, what's there, but it's gentler, it sounds to me, than Shandor's drop you off the top story of the block of flats and see, you know, see if you can find a way to make a parachute before the ground comes flying up at your face. And I guess I wonder, therefore, you know, just how much fierceness, how much confrontation is actually integral to the process of teaching yoga. If what we've got to do is, you know, to a certain extent, you know, guide, push, facilitate, whatever the word is, but jolt people out of comfort zones. It is confronting. And you know, I almost wonder, therefore, should it be banned, or is there a way to do it kindly that means that, yeah, in the current, you know, mentality around a lot of things, it is pushing right up against the limits of what's socially acceptable to say, you know, I'm going to actually confront you, because that's what we're talking about in a way. Otherwise, you stay in the comfort zone.
So I've been canceled many times in the last 5 years by institutions that I have taught for years because of the very thing that you're talking about. Mm. Confrontation in yoga is an essential part of the process. How do we guide our student to the edge of that confrontation without forcing them to go further? And just that's my role as a teacher of yoga right now, is how can I put the student's environment or approach to this environment of confrontation? How can I bring that to them willingly, and not through marketing tricks or, you know, charismatic, you know, charismatic teachers have this ability to energetically pull people along the path. And I've seen it enough to know that that's not what I'm doing. I'm inviting people to build more intimacy into their lives. How? Softening, surrendering. And surrender feels like defeatist, and I'm not teaching surrendering as defeatist. To me, surrendering is accepting things are as they are in that moment. So let's just say, what's a typical confrontation that shows up in a yoga class? Tight hamstrings, you know, or whatever tight part. For me, that was the tight hamstrings was just like hell. And I even in those days related it to childbirth, you know, like it's not even close to what I understand childbirth to be, watching my wife deliver our daughter. But this mental construct that I had about tight hamstrings. So how do I create an environment where people can confront these parts of themselves that they don't fully accept? And I do that with kindness and empathy and with this idea of softness. Now, how did I arrive at this idea of softness? Because in this Western world, we live hard, play hard, work hard. And the one that I just love is we love hard. Like I heard that a few years ago in a workshop, and I'm thinking, love hard? Like, are you crazy? That doesn't work in my relationship. Like, And I know what they were trying to teach, that
Sure, sure.
loving is not easy. Love is a relationship with a beloved is challenging, and it's not easy. But to me, the antidote to what I consider the imbalance in our current, type A, or I sometimes joke, type triple A mentality, is to not take ourselves so seriously and to create softness where hardness exists. And what's beautiful about teaching that lesson on a yoga mat, and the way I teach, is I let the student decide, well, how far are we going to look at this confrontation with resistance in your body? And how can you turn towards it instead of away from it, or try to distance yourself or push through it? And that's the method that I teach from. I use gravity. So if we initiate movement in a yoga pose through mentally imposed effort, it sets up that, what you described, I want to get something and I see the results, but I don't know how to get there, but I'm going to reach out and try and grab it. And what I am teaching is, if I accept things as they are in the moment, how do I create more intimacy with that moment? And like my relationship with a beloved, I found that if I soften, let my heart soften, let my shoulders soften, let my belly soften, that in my situation, my wife finds me much more attractive if I'm soft as I approach than if I'm coming out here like in yoga. What is this? Open heart, open the heart up, If I come to my wife looking for a hug, like in this posture, it doesn't work so well, And so what works exterior also works interior. And anatomically, I understand that as well. So that's the first step. Like, can we shift? And in a way, what Shandor taught me was, you have to drop everything you've learned and start over. And what I'm saying is, well, maybe you don't have to drop everything, but you have to drop some of these so-called sacred commands of a yoga teacher's list of instructions on how to enter a pose physically, and wake up to the fact that we have this subtle body that has more influence. What connective tissue research is showing at the moment is that we have more access to freedom of movement if we soften. Why? If we try to stretch a muscle, there's this understanding of a muscle origin to a muscle insertion. It's a linear process. And there's this, here I am stiff and I want to be flexible. So I'm going to push my body a little bit to kind of stretch into this new reality that's supposed to happen when you get flexible. It's like the promise is, when you get flexible, then your life flows and everything is happy. That isn't my experience with it, because I got a very flexible body and there was still a lot of areas of resistance, let's call it, mentally, emotionally, etc. So connective tissue research is showing that the structure of connective tissue is, they call it multifractal, meaning that it operates in a system, and I can use my hands here, that there's no patterning to the movement of path of connective tissue. It's interwoven with chaos. Now, how do you move into that environment of chaos? And it's not a linear process. It's a multi-dimensional process. And when you think about softening, just think about it, for those of you out here listening or watching, think about this image of softening into any part of your body, softening into your chest, into your shoulders, into your belly. Notice where it moves. And it doesn't move linearly. It moves three-dimensionally, multi-dimensionally. And you can create this awareness of space as you soften. And that space feels good, especially if you're in contracted, mentally imposed or trauma, this attachment to things, traumatic contraction. When you let go of that contraction, what's the feeling? It's bliss. It's freedom. It's what the yogis have been talking about. moksha or ananda, these little moments of freedom and bliss. That's what happens when you surrender. And what is the intuitive call to action in that moment? You want more of it. And you intuitively think, oh, how can I move into this bliss? And as you surrender, gravity is pulling you. If you just surrender your whole body, gravity will pull you all the way to the floor. But the yogis understood, well, you need that surrender component first to create softness. And then you need intelligent engagement. How do you intelligently engage? What part of our bodies is there to create that engagement on a yoga mat? It's our spine. So we engage the spine. How do we do that? Tailbone on one end, base of the skull on the other. Like a slinky toy, we just pull from the ends. And once I learned extension by gently pulling from the ends, my whole practice changed. Because typically extension in a yoga class is lift your chest up, pull the shoulder blades back and down, open your heart. This is full extension and full breath, supposedly. That hasn't been my experience since I started softening through the chest and extending through the back of the skull. That has shifted the amount of energy I use in a pose. So all that energy I was doing muscularly to create this external appearance, that energy has now someplace to apply to somewhere else in my body that needs more attention. And so energetically, whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally, even intellectually, if I apply that attention, intuition says, try this. And that's where I step back as a teacher. I'm not going to go deeper, find the peak pose. You've heard this term in a yoga class, peak pose. There's no such thing as a peak pose. In my experience, I've never met one teacher that says, what happens when you reach the peak,
Well, this is the problem, I suppose. And this is, I guess immediately, especially with the chest opening, making me think about Iyengar again. He had this dictum in a way that if you could just get everything aligned, all the lights would come on and you'd basically get enlightened. I mean, he did say once alignment is enlightenment. I remember this anecdote you have in the book of spending time with Iyengar, while you were still with Shandor. At the time, Shandor was, he later called what he taught shadow yoga, but at this time, I think he was still an Iyengar student and sent you off to see his teacher as you were traveling back from New Zealand to the US. He spent time with Iyengar, who was intensely fierce, as you've described. And yet at the same time, he mentioned something that later, came to make a lot more sense to you as you engage with practice in the way that you've been describing, that was the opposite of trying to impose rigidity of form onto yourself and instead sort of finding your way into the body. And I wonder if you could tell us about what he said about feeling and how that contrasted in a way to, actually the message he gave through his barking of instructions through the average yoga class.
That comment that I'll describe here was so subtle in that moment and so brief that I would say 90% of the people in that room just didn't even realize the subtlety of what he said. And I'll share this, in the moment, I don't think I even understood what he was saying. I just found it curious that he said that. And it wasn't until years later that I discovered what I now believe what he was saying. So I had arrived for the first time in Pune during Iyengar's 70th birthday celebration. And that was the institute was closed for the whole week of classes. They were closed. And there were demonstrations, lectures, and ceremonies that whole week from literally 9 o'clock in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. And you could attend all of it or part of it. And I was there with nothing to do. So I attended everything. And it was physically demanding, sitting for 6 hours a day with little movement, little time to get up and go get water or pee. And so at the end of that week, I was exhausted. And so was everyone else that was there, Western students that had come during that time. They were exhausted. But on that last day, there was a special group of people, reporters from all over the world, photographers, videographers. They were all documenting and writing about this great man's journey in yoga. And here he was celebrating his 70th, this threshold in Indian culture where now he's a master. You're not really a master until you're 70 years old. And so here he is receiving all the accolades from that. And this last day program in the morning, he spoke for 3 hours without a break. No one could leave. And we were just kind of trapped in this. And there was 100 people in, you've been in that room. There's 100 people in this room. We're shoulder to shoulder. It's hot, it's sweaty, and it's uncomfortable. And the first question at the question and answer period from this reporter from Bombay, young guy, the very first question after he just spent 3 hours talking about why he does yoga, the reporter says, "Why do you do yoga?" And you could hear a pin drop in the room. The absurdity of that question in that moment, and the anger that you could see expressed in Iyengar's face. And then in a split second, that facial expression shifted, and he kind of, the corners of his mouth turned up like a smile to himself. He was smiling to himself because he got this, I felt like he got this hit of intuition. Simple question, simple answer. I like the way it makes me feel. Now, and he moved on. It was just like, it was almost like he was dismissing this reporter who hadn't been listening. And he just kind of pushed him to the side and needed some more validation from someone more important or whatever. That was the judgment at the time that I had. But years later, through my own experiences of meeting confrontation in my life, I started to realize that parts of my body were numb. Like I couldn't feel parts of my body that were completely shut down, especially around my heart. And why is that? Because I have been traumatized through loss, through death, through divorce, etc. And this vulnerability around the heart was something that I just shut down. And then all of a sudden, things started to chisel away at that armor that I had. And I started to feel, and that ability to feel was powerful. And then it dawned on me, that's what he meant. He doesn't, I mean, he may like the way yoga makes him feel because it feels good, but it gave him the ability to feel more intimately into all his self, all his selves, his different bodies, the koshas. He was able to feel physically, he was able to feel emotionally, he was able to feel energetically. Because of the practice of yoga, he had this expanded ability to meet and become intimate with these other bodies. And that's what I think he said. And if that awareness could be taught more regularly in, let's say, an Iyengar yoga class, I think there would be a whole shift, and a natural shift, let's say, in the way Iyengar yoga is taught. And that's been my experience. I started to apply that, and I started to realize that what I had learned in Iyengar yoga was starting to fall away. It became I needed to go through that process to get me to this point. But like anything powerful in life, there comes a moment where you have to discard what's brought you to this point to move into the next step in your path towards wellness or growth, etc. And so most of what I've learned, I still get students coming saying, "Oh, I heard you're an Iyengar teacher." And I said, well, I was, and I've moved into a space that Iyengar yoga, the experience of Iyengar yoga, has helped me see. And that quote, that experience of listening to Iyengar say it, is that permission, let's call it, to explore. And writing the book, I started to see this pattern of each generation of this lineage from Krishnamacharya, how his senior teachers, look at Iyengar, Patabi Choice, and Desikachar. They all studied from the same master, and yet their three styles of yoga are dramatically different. How is that possible? It's the receiving information, processing it through your own creativity and intuition to develop something that is your yoga, a personal style of yoga. And if you're motivated to teach like I am, then I try and share that. And my goal as a teacher is to bring students to a point and then step back and get out of the way and support their own process to awaken their intuition. And they get it. And at some point, there's another quote in my book, Walt Whitman. Do you remember that one?
I don't know that I do. No.
Yeah, it's basically he who learns, I'm going to paraphrase it, he who learns from me learns basically to kill the teacher, meaning if someone learns from me and they go beyond what I taught them, that's what he says. He who learns to, he used a swimming metaphor, spread a stroke, a breast wider than my own, is a proper student of mine. And he who most honors me kills the teacher. And when I say this in class, I joke, I said, don't take this literally, but metaphorically, I become irrelevant. I'm just like a trail post when you're hiking and you see an arrow and the arrow is saying trail goes this way. I'm that arrow. You come to my class and I'm going to probably point you in a direction that you hadn't been going before. If the teacher you're learning with is not pushing you towards, or not pushing, guiding you towards intuition, then I'd say it's time maybe to reconsider the direction that you're going. Because ultimately, we all have to take that solo journey, right?
Well, exactly. Yeah. And
Yeah,
that's obviously at odds with the capitalist logic of the modern yoga marketplace, which we can get onto
exactly.
a little bit more a little later.
Exactly.
Before we go there, though, I'd like to just touch on one other experience you had in India with another very influential teacher, who I think Iyengar told you not to go and see, S.N.
Right.
Goenka. And so you did a 10-day Vipassana retreat where you were strongly encouraged to sit with strong determination through the pain. And found some insight as well through that process of just being
Yeah.
in your body with whatever's arising.
Yeah. So when I had no awareness of Vipassana or Goenka when I first arrived in Pune. And then after 6 months or so of being there, I started to hear Iyengar warn about certain teachers that if you went to study with them, it would confuse what you were learning in Pune with him. And that confusion could be dangerous. He used that word, dangerous. And I started to dwell on the fact that he didn't mention it just once, he mentioned it a lot. And there was some real concern that he had for his students of confusion and being dangerous. And one day I was walking downtown in Pune, and the street markets, the vendors on sheets or blankets with used books and all sorts of things they were trying to sell to live. And I looked down, and The Art of Living was the name of this book. And it's a book written by one of Goenka's students.
William Hart, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And I didn't know that. I just liked the title, The Art of Living. So I picked that book up, and it was like 10 rupees or something like that. And I couldn't put the book down. And it was like, this is what I'm being warned about. And I thought to myself, no, this is something that's calling me. And the coincidence, remember I earlier talked to you about coincidence in my life. That book showed up in my life right at the right time. At the end of the year that I studied with in Pune, there was some time I had before I had to leave India to travel. And the first target of my itinerary was Igapuri, where Goenka lived and where he taught. And I wanted to do a 10-day course, and there was perfect timing. And so I got to Igapuri without really knowing much about it other than what was in this book. Mm. And I had just spent a year completely transforming my physical body. So I felt I had the stamina to physically endure that intensity of sitting, but I wasn't so sure mentally if my mind was going to be able to sit and dwell on my breath for 8 hours a day and observe my mind. But I was ready. I was ready to try. And as I describe in the book, the first 3 days was pretty easy for me. Like my mind was cooperating, my body was feeling great, my hips were wide open, my spine was happy. And I was really, God, this is fantastic. Day 4, I think it was day 4. Oh my God, pain in one hip, pain in my neck, and eventually pain over the entire length of my spine. And by the 6th day, no, sorry, by the 5th day, I think 5th or 6th, I started to get a little anxious. Like the panic was starting to come around the corner of my inner vision. Like I'm in over my head. And so I started repeating this mantra. No one's ever gone to emergency from a sitting injury. No one's ever gone to emergency from a sitting injury. Because all I was doing was sitting. And that process of kind of mentally separating from the experience lasted for about a day. It worked. It kind of took me out of panic. But then that stopped working. And by day 8, I was just ready to quit. And I finished the morning session in so much pain that I decided, that's it, I'm done. I'm leaving. And I could feel this need to break down. And where the meditation hall was a distance from where we would break and eat and drink tea and stuff. And the other direction was into a forest. And the forest was beautiful, dense foliage where I could go and be private. And I went out into the forest and I fell down onto my knees and I prayed, as I describe in the book, to this God that I didn't know to just help me. And there was absolute silence and nothing, no inner voice. I was alone. I was by myself. I was a wreck. And then I got up and I went to the tent where I was sleeping at night. And I laid down on this bed. It was a cot. And I wasn't going to go back. I was going to stay there and then eventually leave. And then I had this moment in that tent on that cot that is difficult to find words for. And I tried to find words for it in the book, where an inner sensation arose in me where I was losing control of the experience. Like I couldn't just believe that I was imagining it. It was a visceral experience that was filling me. What I come to understand is maybe what Kundalini is, but the descriptions of Kundalini, meaning it stayed central to the spine, wasn't the experience that I was having. And it was more inclusive of my whole body. My whole body had a powerful energy that was taking over. And it felt like, frankly, it was going to swallow me. It was going to consume me. And I was going to lose my mind. And in that moment, I panicked and I tried to wake up out of this state of consciousness, but my physical body wouldn't move. And so now I'm trapped in a physical body that's like a nuclear reaction out of control. And my mind is like frightened. And so I try to lunge off the side of the bed, and 2 or 3 attempts, and I finally get my body off the edge and I fall, 18 inches to the floor, but I'm still kind of stuck. And in that very moment, one of the assistants who saw that I wasn't in class came looking for me. And he saw me on the floor and he said, "What are you doing?" I'm on the floor. My body's now slowly starting to come, like falling asleep, a limb falling asleep. And I'm starting to move. And I just said, "Listen, I fell asleep and and I fell." And he said, "Okay, you want to come back to this hall?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll come back." So I get back to the hall, I sit in meditation, and all the pain in my body was completely gone, completely. And for the next 2 days, and day 9, it was like bliss. And I show up on day 10 thinking, I'm going to cruise home, My body feels good. My mind is clear. I'm at peace. And on that last day, the pain was like, Only this time I had a context for what I was experiencing. And I realized the temporary nature of all sensation is it's temporary. Our reality is change. And this came crystal clear to me during the 10 days. And do we have the patience to observe without judgment and keep the mind clear? And that 10-day Vipassana course helps build that clearness muscle. And is my experience typical? No, I don't think so. I think some people kind of arrive at that realization without what appears to be, in hindsight, a very dramatic, expression of reaching my limit. But that experience of the temporary nature of sensation on that 10th day, by the end of the day, I had resolved the mental suffering and I was at peace with the physical intensity of what I was feeling. And I knew anatomically that I was safe, that there wasn't anything wrong with my physiology. There was still some subtle imbalances in my either emotional or mental body that was causing that energetic stagnation that produced a sensation of what we refer to as pain. And to me, this is what I learned in that moment. The body has ways to communicate to the other bodies, the the mental, emotional, energetic, and even the bliss body has ways to communicate. And the language that the body uses is sensation or pain. And if we notice the sensation early enough, the pain doesn't get too intense. But if we wait, if we run from the sensation or try to cover it with even yoga practice or cover it with medication, we're not addressing the root. And the root is this realization that all sensation is temporary. Once we experience that understanding, then the mental suffering and the emotional suffering is mitigated. And is it completely free? Well, keep meditating and see if you're completely free.
Well, you certainly had to put it to the test a few years later, it sounds like, as you experienced a bad back injury while teaching and then were once more, on the floor, barely able to move and
or breathe.
Also, had to find your way back into that intuition and slowly realize that was going to become, practice and almost, the pathway into your own style of teaching was to guide people into feeling.
Exactly. The broken back had an intensity equal, if not higher, than the intensity I was feeling in Vipassana. And the more urgent challenge, though, was it hurt to breathe. To inhale created sharp pain in my spine and in my legs. The legs were already a little bit numb, and there was this paradox of pain and numbness that I didn't really understand. So I realized quickly that to avoid pain inhaling, I had to breathe very shallow. So like 1 to 2 second inhale, that's all I could do until the pain. If I breathed any longer or deeper, the contraction of the diaphragm, there was something away the diaphragm contraction, and later in connective tissue research, I understand this now. As the diaphragm contracts on an inhale, the diaphragm has attachments to the lower lumbar spines where the back was broken. And that wave of communication in the connective tissue of the diaphragm moved through the connective tissue network right to the attachments into the lumbar spine. And it caused a little bit of compression on that damaged nerve in the broken back. And that's what I was feeling anatomically. So the shallow breath worked to keep the mind a little bit pacified. And on the exhale, I started to notice a short exhale, but I was completely free of the physical pain. And then I came to that awareness, well, all I have to do is lengthen my exhales. So with practice, this is over a 2-week period. I was still breathing, say 1 to 2 second inhales, but my exhales got up to about 28 seconds. So if you look at the proportion between 2 seconds and 28 seconds, 92% of the time I'm out of pain. And in that extended exhale, being surrendered, because there was literally the surrender of an exhale, this softness in my body. The parasympathetic nervous system, what I find out later in the research for the book, the most powerful stimulant into the parasympathetic nervous system is the exhale. And the exhale works as you, not deeply, but the length of it. In other words, the duration. So I'm not trying to overfill my lungs. Breathe deeply. No, breathe slowly. Same amount of air in an extended period of time. And that's the pump that pushes the subtle energy into that vagal nerve, that parasympathetic response in the body. And I discovered that without understanding the science. I just discovered, hey, if I lengthen my exhales that amount of time, and I started to feel the ability to move more. Once I got that ability to move more, I started to breathe deeper, because instead of feeling that spike of pain at 2 seconds, I started feeling it at 4 seconds. And then a week after that, I started feeling that spike of pain at 8 seconds. So as the inhale started to increase, I could decrease my exhale because it started to balance. And eventually, you know, just to show you how kind of anal retentive I am at times, I built up to about a 60-second inhale and a 60-second exhale. So for 2 minutes is one breath. And that produces, this is not something you do overnight. If you're listening and you want to try this, it builds up over a year. And over a year, I got that confidence that I could breathe as if I was inhaling 1 molecule of oxygen at a time. How slow could you breathe if you were visualizing 1 molecule dripping down from the tip of the nostrils to the pelvic floor? And same on the exhale, 1 molecule of CO2 exiting from the pelvic floor back up. And what I found is that's the perfect environment for the immune system and the parasympathetic nervous system to reset itself and to strengthen. And after 12 months of doing this, I healed my back without surgery. And the disc that was crushed seems to have regenerated the fluid inside to create cushion. And the rip in the membrane of that disc has obviously been repaired to hold that fluid. Most science currently is saying that that's possible, but unlikely. But I proved it to myself that it is possible, but it requires some major changes in your life. You can't just do things as usual. You can't go to work for 8 hours and sit in a chair. You have to find special chairs to sit in, and you have to take frequent breaks, which is what I did. So that's what I learned from Vipassana, applied it to a real life situation with my back. And then, this is to conclude this, I started to recognize, okay, lower back, there's this chakra down there that I vaguely understand, but maybe these other areas in my body that I hold tension, this breathing practice of using the slowing down of the breath and the softening around my heart might bring some space around this lack of feeling in my chest from too much chest lifting and too much psychological trauma. Maybe softening here might open some space to create an awareness and a feeling awareness. And that worked. And so I've got this kind of belly center with the diaphragm, this heart center with my softening around this trauma stored around my heart. And the next thing that I realized was I have a lot of trauma in my throat. Arthritis was in the neck was one of the reasons I started yoga physically. And then in the process, I don't think this story's in the book, but I had 3 near-death experiences with drowning. So 3 times in my life, I've been trapped, submerged in water, either in a boat or a kayak or something, where I was confronting my last breath and with no visible means of escape. And the contraction of the muscles to keep water out of my lungs and my throat. After all 3 of those experiences, the first one being the worst, it took months for me to release the tension consciously. And then there was still all that unconscious trauma in my throat that wasn't there until I started to understand this process of softening the front of the throat and feeling the weight of my thyroid gland drop a little bit. Softening the sides of the tongue, feeling the root of the tongue drop a little bit. Softening the hinges of the jaw. So I was looking at these landmarks around the throat center and looking where I held tension in my jaw, or tension in my lips, or tension in my throat, tension in the tongue. And that release started to create these openings in the throat. And so then it was just logical. Well, what about the pelvic floor? What about the third eye? And this is this awakening, what Iyengar calls, I quoted him in my book, the uncoiling of chakra. And I'd never looked at that word uncoiling before with this understanding. And Iyengar used that word, really interesting word to use about a subtle body experience. Uncoiling what? He didn't mention that. But for me, it's uncoiling the trauma stored in the energetic body, the mental body, and even the intellect body. And the physical body responded. And that's also a new understanding. If you release in the subtle body level, the physical body just lets go. The physical body just softens and opens, and you move through it. And now the trauma, the samskara, is completely exited, not to return.
That's fascinating to hear it articulated in that way. And you do use this term subtle body in the subtitle of the book. And at the same time, I do get the sense, though, that you're mainly talking about the subtle experience of being embodied, and the way in which you explain it from a practice perspective and a teaching perspective is quite clear about that it's not something otherworldly. It's
Right.
actually it's the experience of being in a body. And by the same token, that some of those things you just referred to, like chakra systems that come from, ancient tantric texts borrowed into physical yoga in the medieval era, aren't actually talking about what's physically present in the body. They're blueprints for re-engaging with the mind and the body in a particular way, for
That's right.
the visualization of something or the bringing of something into being. And it actually, therefore, practice doesn't need to include those terms or those concepts at all necessarily, but unless it does get into the subtle experience of being embodied, it's very hard to actually engage with the process of healing, because, as you say, that's happening somewhere beneath the surface of the physical shell. And we have to be able to feel what's actually wrong in order to learn where that uncoiling, the letting go again, comes back into the process. And if we can't actually feel what we're gripping, and there's a lot of gripping in Iyengar's technique, it's very hard to realize the antidote to that process. So it's at a level which isn't in the mind, it's not in the body, it's somewhere between the two, in the felt experience of being alive in a body.
I think that the ancient ancestors of yoga, our ancestors of yoga, understood that the physical body is just one of the bodies we inhabit, and that the mind is in all the bodies. So we associate the mind with our brain, but science has shown we have a mind in our gut, we have a mind in our heart, we have minds in connective tissue. And connective tissue, recent research shows that connective tissue doesn't just wrap organs, wrap joints, wrap bones, but they penetrate organs, penetrate tissues, penetrate. This was a wake-up call for me. Penetrate bone. And I just read a week ago that they're finding that the bone is actually a form of connective tissue. And that, I didn't include that research in the book. That's something that's just been discovered since I wrote my book, that bone is a type of connective tissue. Had you ever heard that?
I hadn't, no.
Yeah.
No.
So to me, it's like, this makes perfect sense. How? We have an expression in the English language, I feel it in my bones. Where does that come from? Is it coming from an experience? I think it is. What is the experience? Now that I understand connective tissue more thoroughly with this current revelation of bone being a type of connective tissue, the yogis talk about nadis as channels. Some books say 80,000 channels, some say 108,000 channels. And these numbers are arbitrary in my experience, because who's counting? Like, who is that person or being that's counting? Okay, here's, 10,347, and that has a name. No one's done that. But what Shandor taught me was to look and read in between the lines. When you hear someone, like, here's an example. One of the poses that I mastered with Shandor was Mayurasana, this kind of pose where you're balancing on your hands on your navel, floating above the air. And when you look at the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, that pose, it describes cures all diseases. Now, Mayurasana, the peacock, it has a reputation for being able to digest everything, including poison. You can try and poison a peacock and it doesn't die because its digestive fire is so strong that it assimilates and it excretes the toxic stuff through its digestive system. So that's the symbolism of peacock, I think, for that pose. So when I think about cures all diseases, that's ridiculous because the body isn't just this ability to apply some external pressure and it magically transforms the body. What it's saying to me is, pay attention. This is a really important pose. And this is why the author of that said, cures all diseases. It's getting your attention. Of all the poses to practice, and there's a few, it's not just Mayurasana, where they use this term. These are super important poses. For Mayurasana, it's digestive fire. The chakra, Nabi chakra, is this processing center for digestion, physical digestion, mental digestion, emotional digestion. And when you create gravity through the pose and put intense pressure on this center in the body, it awakens something in you. And so that understanding, then I apply it to connective tissue and nadis. They're saying 100,000 channels because this is a really important aspect of our experience of a body. And it's not to be taken lightly. Focus on connective tissue. And that's what current science is saying, that our body's mobility is more determinant on the mobility of our connective tissue network than the flexibility in our muscles and the flexibility in our joints. Create flexibility in the connective tissue and the joints and the muscles respond. And that's my experience, that I rarely talk, I don't even use the word stretch anymore in a yoga class. And I rarely cue physical body adjustments. I cue subtle body adjustments. I'm trying to create this awareness that through the word softness, you have a window into influencing movement in connective tissue. And that subtle movement is sensation in the channels. And maybe the early yogis, they were really talking about connective tissue. They just didn't have a scientific model of it. But
it's possible. I guess, we always have to be open to the prospect as well that things have changed and that perhaps priorities are very different and that our understanding is now different. And it's very tempting to assume that the discoveries that are being reached now had been somehow intuited at an earlier stage. But it might just have meant also, the specific reference in that verse is also to diseases of the abdominal area. And if you are sticking your elbows in your belly for a short period of time every day, it's going to certainly help you move things through and out the other end. And
that's right. That's exactly it. On a simplistic level, that's exactly what happens. And that's been my experience. Mayurasana is better than a shot of espresso in the morning.
There you go. I wanted to ask you one more thing before we wind up, and it's to come right back to where we started, and it's to talk about Manduka very briefly.
Sure.
Obviously, that's a whole story in itself, but how did you come to be running a yoga mat company when you're so immersed in yoga practice? What turned you into a yogapreneur?
Well, I think the fact that I was an architect, my mind is one of those things where I look at things and I'm always thinking, how could that have been done differently? And the yoga mat was a perfect example. I owned a studio. Every day after classes, I would have to sweep, actually after every class, I'd have to sweep the floor because the mats would peel in these little kernels of yoga mat would be all scattered over the studio floor. And I thought, there's got to be a better material for this. And literally within 6 months of me thinking about this, Shandor shows up from his trip he used to go from Germany straight to San Luis Obispo. And he shows up with this black mat, and I'm thinking, hey, where'd you get that? And he goes, in Germany, you want one? And I said, yeah, I'd love one. He said, here's a phone number. This guy named Klaus. Klaus, if you're listening, thank you for your presence in my life. So Klaus had a friend that worked in this factory where the original yoga mats were discovered. And
I mean, you call them yoga mats, but they were for another purpose, weren't they? They were for underlaying carpets.
Yeah, carpet underlayment. And this, English yoga teacher discovered that cut that carpet underlayment up, and it's a perfect, and I'll give her credit, Angela Farmer. She figured out, let's cut these into yoga platforms and we'll practice our yoga on. And so Shandor shows up. I call Klaus and I say, hey, can I get a mat? And he said, well, it depends. And I said, well, it depends on what? You have to order $25,000 worth of mats. And I go, what do you mean? And he said, I'm not a retail business. I'm a wholesale business. And I said, oh, okay. Let me think about it. I'll call you back. And the next day I called him back and I said, okay. And I borrowed convenience checks. Back in the day, credit card offers, you'd get these checks where you'd get $10,000 for practically nothing just by opening a new credit card with these convenience checks that you had a month to pay them off. So I thought, oh, I'll do this. I'll just get a bunch of credit cards, get the $25,000, send in the check, and then I'll have a year to deal with it. It's just 6 months, sorry. I'll have 6 months to deal with it. Well, at the end of 6 months, I hadn't sold $25,000 worth. So I got some more credit cards. It was my pyramid scheme. I would pay off the credit cards coming due with the new credit cards. And then the additional money that I had left over, I'd pay off the mats. So this happened. This worked for about a year, selling mats, mostly out of my studio in San Luis, which was really thriving at the time. But also my traveling with Yoga Journal as a writer for Yoga Journal and going to Yoga Journal conferences, people would ask me, hey, I heard you have these mats. How can I get one? So I started kind of selling. I was teaching at Yoga Journal, but selling kind of out of my garage at home. And I would ship these mats. And that's how the business began. Just Yoga Journal conferences, getting people's phone numbers and addresses and shipping when I got home direct to them. And then, one thing led to another, and I started to think, wow, this could grow. And the internet was starting, and I thought, okay, I started ordering containers, and the containers would fit perfectly, a small container in my garage here at the house. And I hired a kid, and he was my warehouseman, and I would just take orders on the answering machine at our studio. And I had enough money to put an ad in Yoga Journal. And so I gifted all these celebrity yoga teachers that I was meeting at Yoga Journal conferences, like, Shiva Ray and Eric Schiffman and Rod Stryker, Rodney Yee. These were like the marquee yoga teachers of the day. And I had just met them, I was like fans of theirs. And I said, hey, can I send you this new type of yoga mat? And if you like it, just get back to me. And so they loved the mats. And so I took out an ad in Yoga Journal, and it just had a picture of the mat with its kind of traditional curl, because the mats are so thick, the ends tend to curl a little bit. And I said in the ad, these teachers own a Manduka yoga mat. And I listed like 30 teachers that had gifted mats to. And the ad, literally that little ad in the back of the magazine, the first week that the copy of that magazine was out on the market, we had like 200 orders on our answering machine at the studio. The next week we had 400. The following week we had 600. And it just kind of kept growing like that, about 200 orders a week for the next year. And then it got serious. I outgrew my garage. That first year, we were on back order for most of the year because it was a 2-month process between ordering and receiving shipping from Germany. But that's how it started, and that's how it continued. And at year 10, it was just, okay, I've done that. Time to move on. And I sold the company.
But why, in the very first instance, did you feel moved to do that and not just get on a plane, go see Klaus, give him the cash for one mat, and then come home again?
In that evening, I talk about that. I waited a day to give him a decision. And that night, I was married at the time. And I went to my wife and I said, here's this opportunity. I'd like to borrow another $25,000 to start this business. And we were in $80,000 debt remodeling our house, mostly funded by credit cards. And so she said, absolutely not. And so that night I went to bed and I couldn't fall asleep. And I was awake the whole night. And I had this mental loop going in my head. This is your once in a lifetime opportunity. This is your once in a lifetime opportunity. And I was a businessman. I was running an architectural practice. I understood the value of having money and how it opens things sometimes in your world. And that morning, my wife went off to work and I had that existential moment. What do I do? Do I call Klaus and say no, or do I call Klaus and say yes? I came to the conclusion, the decision to say yes. And I knew I had 2 months to tell my wife. And I just felt confident that I could find a way to tell her that I had not listened and that I had acted based on intuition. I had 2 months. So I got busy. 2 months went by like that. And I'm approaching 2 months. It was like 2 weeks before 2 months. And I'm in Europe teaching. And I get this phone call from my wife. And she says, hey, there's something really strange in our driveway at home. And I go, what's that? It's a shipping container. The container truck driver just put the container in our driveway because there was no room on the street. And she said, what's inside the container? And I go, oh, I was going to tell you, it wasn't supposed to be here for another 2 weeks. And that was not a great way to start a marriage that was only like 6 months old. And in hindsight, we worked through it to a point. The relationship was definitely starting off on the wrong foot, but the business took off so quickly, and she started to understand the reasons why I said yes. And so there was a little bit of forgiveness. But to be honest, looking in hindsight, I probably would have done it differently. And I probably would not have had the ramp up that Manduka became. However, that's looking backwards. And at this point in my life, I look at all things now as gifts. Like, if something good happens, that's a gift. If something bad happens, eventually that's going to be a gift too. So I'm in a really solid relationship now, just on the personal level, with a second wife. And it was almost like my first marriage relationship was let's call it my doctoral degree in relationship. And I learned in that doctoral degree what doesn't work. And then my second marriage is applying what I learned in my first marriage to this second marriage, which is, we just celebrated 16 years together. And for me, that's a legacy that I want to leave behind, is this ability to be in relationship with people no matter what.
Thank you. There's one other dimension to it that I feel I have to raise, though, in that context. Obviously, there's a great service been provided to yoga practitioners who are enormous fans of Manduka mats. And yet, at the same time, the whole philosophy of yoga is founded on an idea of sort of non-acquisitiveness, not getting more than one needs. Do you see a tension between the very idea of yoga and business?
I do. But I also see the same tension between East and West. And I see tension, especially now, between masculine and feminine. And it to me, it seems like life is tension. And I had a drum teacher tell me this once. When the tension in a drum head is perfect, you produce music. When the tension in the drum head is too little, it's bad music. And when the tension is too tight on a drum head, the drum breaks, the tension breaks, and there's no music. So in a way, this Western Eastern tension translates also between attachment and non-attachment of material things. And at some point, each one of us has this personal journey on a relationship between accumulating and releasing. To me, it's non-attachment in a way. Like, I believe that everything I own, I can let go of in a moment's notice. My house, my car, my yoga mat, it goes, and I don't think twice. I've sold or had taken in a divorce 2 yoga studios, and the community of those studios went with it. And that was a huge loss for me, relationship-wise, of a community that went with my ex-wife or went with the new owners of the studio. I'm okay with that. And I'm in the business to inspire. And I inspire, and then those people move on, and I move on. It seems to be a balanced way of living, and it's finding that balance and also recognizing imbalance. And that's I've become really good at. I recognize imbalance in these attachments sooner than later. Like, I can know within a day or two if something is too much. And if I recognize it's too much, I let it go. That's how I resolve it. And I think everyone has that opportunity, let's say, to find balance with that tension that you described.
You know, it's a very poignant way of putting it. We all live in the world. I mean, the old yoga texts were talking about leaving the world behind. So as soon as we live in the world, we have to make compromises. We don't have the luxury of just disappearing off into a cloud in the back of the cave and turning our backs on everything else. So there will be tension. That's how we handle it.
I want to add one thing to that.
Mm.
We may not have a choice. We may not have a choice living in the world to let go of certain things, because I feel with climate change, and you see it on the news every day, that we're going to be forced eventually into a confrontation with letting go. And are we using this time as individuals to prepare for what is coming in the short term, within the next decade, or maybe even this generation? Are we preparing ourselves for that type of life, when the things that we take for granted right now don't exist anymore? And that awareness for me helps me make decisions. Do I really need a new car right now? Or do I really need a new whatever? Can I live within my means in this moment and be content with things as they are in the moment? And the answer for me is yes. And not all the time, but usually within a day or two, I see how to be present with what is, and I let go, I surrender. And to me, that's, if you look at the past 4 years, we've lost so much of what we took for granted temporarily. And now we have an opportunity, in a way, to reconnect with certain things, things that may still serve us, or things that in hindsight now don't really serve us. Can we move comfortably away from those things, even though they were familiar, no longer serve us? And where are we going? This is the part of yoga that draws me back to my mat every day, Daniel. This is the part of yoga for me that is eternal. we have this opportunity to relate to our existence in a body in this moment. And that's going to change at some point. What are we doing to prepare for that change? And for me, it's live a full life, live a kind, empathetic life. And everything else is entertainment.
That's a great note to end it on. Thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciated this conversation.
Same.
It's been a real pleasure.
And I look forward to seeing you in London next year when I'm on tour.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Bye-bye.